there are some insanely popular, really classic trails here in Oregon that really do not need promotion. Because of that, some of these trails are getting overused and abused to a degree. And then there are some trails that I intentionally omitted because they've been so severely damaged by recent fire or weather events that I either safe or worthwhile for hiking any longer. It was a lot of on the ground survey work to examine each and every one of these locations and then determine if I feel comfortable directing people to go and hike in these locations.
Welcome back to the 10 Adventures podcast. Today we are talking about finding epic hikes in the Pacific Northwest, specifically about where to hike in Oregon. On the show to share his expertise is Eli Boschetto, author of the recently released 100 Classic Hikes in Oregon Trail Guide. Hi, Eli. Welcome to the show.
Hi, good to be with you today.
I'm excited to talk about hiking in Oregon because actually I've never been there. So I'm going to be sitting here like a sponge, learning about all your insider knowledge. So, Eli, before we talk about hiking specifically in Oregon, can you share a little bit about yourself and what led you to write this book?
Well, this is my fifth book with Mountaineers Books. And this one came about because 100 Classic Hikes Oregon was one of their titles that was done by a classic Oregon trail author named Doug Lorraine, who has since retired out. And I was approached by my editor and asked if I would like to take over the title, give the book a fresh update with new information, new trails, and share a new approach to some of the classic hikes that we've got here in Oregon.
And so that's really interesting. You've taken over the title from a prior author. It's a well-known book in the hiking community. Did you change a lot of the hikes out? Did was your definition of a classic hike different and resulted in, some changes to the rankings of the 100 classic hikes?
The concept of a classic hike is pretty subjective, and it can all be determined by your approach and how you view something that, you know, is worthy of the title classic and, you know, what applies to make it classic. But my approach to doing this was to first review all of the trails that were in the previous edition of this book. And the first task was to just pretty much see if the trails were all still accessible and hikeable and worth hiking. Um, Many of them were no longer worth going and making the effort because trails get abandoned, they get neglected, through various weather or wildfire events. They might not be safe or accessible anymore. So that's the first thing that I had to do when I approached the title to determine what stays and what goes. And then my editor at Mountaineers was gave me the latitude to really make it my own and choose some of my own favorite trails that I considered classics and swap those out with what might have been previous classics. So it's kind of a fresh take on hiking in Oregon with the concept of these being some of the best trails to go and discover the different parts of our state.
I'm really interested about this balance of classic trails in terms of well-loved trails that everyone knows and lesser known gems. How did you navigate that issue? Because there's always people when you let go of one of these gems, people get upset. They're like, "Oh no, that was always the hike where we could go and there is nobody there, or there's great views." How did you balance, that challenge of, the well-known and the beautiful ones no one knows?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I actually have, language to address exactly that in the introduction of this book, because there are some insanely popular, really classic trails here in Oregon that really do not need promotion because everybody knows about them. They're easy to find information about online. And so, and because of that, some of these trails are getting, overused and abused to a degree. And so I felt, as it's my responsibility to make sure that I steer people towards good places to hike, but not steer too many people to places that are already obviously known and overused. And so there are a few locations that I intentionally left out, that people might be curious about. And then there are some trails that I intentionally omitted because they've been so severely damaged by recent fire or weather events that I didn't think them either safe or worthwhile for hiking any longer. It was a lot of on the ground survey work to examine each and every one of these locations and then determine if I feel comfortable directing people to go and hike in these locations and if they'll be, safe and able to, you know, enjoy a hike in these places.
And I think that that's exactly why I'm still a big believer in guidebooks. And if you go on social media and you see some people directing people onto, dangerous routes or, places that are, maybe off limits at certain times of the year, the dedication you've put into making sure these routes are still able to do, still safe. That's I think the benefit of buying a physical guidebook. But I want to talk more about your experience because this is your fifth guidebook. So I feel like you're a bit of an expert in backpacking and hiking in Oregon. But do you remember your first hike and what was it? And like, how old were you? What do you remember of it?
Oh gosh, my very first hike. That's that was a long time ago. Um, well, when I grew up in Southern California, my family spent our summers oftentimes um, camping and hiking in the Southern Sierra Mountains, and so I can remember hiking waterfall trails along the Kern River. Um, Probably one of my most vivid memories is hiking the Mist Trail in Yosemite Valley, going up the wall along Vernal Falls. Um, and at the time, my brother and me leaving our parents in the dust as we ran up the stairs and ran back down and ran back up again. And so um, I got a very early introduction to the outdoors, and it obviously stuck because I've managed to make a career out of it.
Let's talk a little bit about hiking in Oregon. Um, I think people know, have an idea about what hiking's like in California and maybe up in Washington State, and obviously in Colorado. What do you think makes Oregon so special as a destination and kind of contrasts it from nearby states?
Well, having done, quite a bit of hiking in all of those states that you've mentioned, especially in California, where my wife and I are originally from, there are definitely challenges in those areas with regards to terrain and elevation and other factors. And by contrast, Oregon, I feel, is a very easily accessible state to hike. Um, our trailheads are largely accessible by good roads. Our elevations are fairly moderate, so you are not getting so high that it becomes a challenge. Um, Trail conditions can vary from area to area, but in a lot of ways, trails are very well kept and easily accessible. So you don't have to be, a professional outdoors person or an Uber athlete to hike in Oregon. All of our trails feel very accessible for any kind of hiker, whether you're a novice or an expert. And they're, scalable so you can really tailor your outings to however near or far you're comfortable going.
And was there anything writing this book? Obviously, you had to, scour and go through Oregon. Was there anything that you learned or any part that maybe you didn't know that, really surprised you of saying, oh man, I didn't know this part of Oregon and it really wowed me?
During the course of writing this book, this is my first statewide book. My previous books were really focused on particular areas, such as the Pacific Crest Trail or Mount Hood. And so this was my first real professional opportunity to go and scour trails across the entire state. And the one area that I found particularly appealing and quite a surprise was in the southeastern region of the state, which is, fairly remote. It takes a considerable effort to get out there because it's all like just desert high country. Um, but there's an area out there called Steens Mountain, which happens to be the largest fault block mountain in the United States. And it's this isolated mountain range that's been carved up by glaciers. It has these fantastic valleys and canyons and some very high lakes that you can get into. And it was a surprisingly enjoyable place to go and hike out in the middle of nowhere, Oregon. And It took me a couple of tries to get out there because I encountered some weather issues. But I I am really looking forward to going and exploring more in that area because it was surprisingly great.
You break the state up into different regions in the book and have hikes in these different regions. And looking at the photos, one thing that surprised me is how diverse the state is. There's real, it's not just all the same. I think that's really compelling as someone who's, thinking of planning a trip. But can you maybe just break down the state into the different parts you focus on in this book and try and describe what each of these parts, what makes it so alluring for a potential hiker who's considering a weekend break or maybe in a full week exploring in the summer.
Oh, yeah, sure. So I kind of consider the state having four main regions for going and hiking, depending on, where folks' interests lie. And starting from the west, right along the coast, we have the entire Oregon coast and coast range that has a variety of opportunities. Which are all quite unique and fascinating. The Oregon coast is just spectacular in many locations. Um, and then moving eastward across the state, um, we've got the Central Valley with all of our major population centers, and then just east of there is the next major area, which is Oregon's Cascade Range. And so that is where you get the chain of forests and mountains that traverse the entire state from south to north. All of Oregon's big peaks are all lined up along the Cascade Range. Um, that's also the track of the Pacific Crest Trail as it traverses the state. And there's just countless opportunities for exploring throughout the Cascades. A lot of that is forested terrain as it skirts Oregon's big volcanoes. There's lots of lakes and creeks and just little hidden gems to discover. Then moving eastward from the Cascades, once you get into the central and eastern parts of the state, the two big areas are in the Northeast. There's an area that encompasses the Wallowa and Blue Mountains. And this is where I direct people who want to get into some, really spectacular kind of glacial alpine country, which I would liken to what you might see in the Sierra Nevada mountains or in the North Cascades. It's lots of high granite peaks, lots of alpine meadows and lakes. Um, it's a more remote area, so it doesn't draw the same crowds that some of the other locations get. Um, and then the other area below there is Oregon's central and southeast regions. And this is where you get into the high desert prairies and the plains, lots of juniper forests, some volcanic features, such as craters and cinder cones. The opportunities are fewer and farther between in that area, but that's where you can find some real gems to get away from virtually everybody else if you're willing to make the extra effort to get out there.
Years ago, I was talking with someone from Oregon, and they said you can find a hike like every day of the year. And I was just wondering, is that the case? And if so, like, where would you direct people to go by season?
Well, let's see, just because I'm based in Portland. Um, and so just keeping that perspective in mind, if I were to start in the spring, I would direct folks to trails in the Columbia River Gorge, which is famous for its waterfalls. Spring is obviously the best time for that, with all of the snow coming out of the mountains and filling up those waterfalls. They're quite scene to see. Then moving into summer, um, I mean, that's where, I mean, you have the entire state you know, at your calling, because once the snows melt off of the roads and the trails, then you can, pretty much go wherever you like. I like going to that northeast region where the Wallowa and Blue Mountains offer some really unique opportunities and some spectacular high country. Um, for fall, um, I might direct people to maybe an east of the Cascades hike where they might be able to pick up some fall color with, the white oak, the vine maples, the alpine larch, putting on some showy displays. There's a variety of trails in some of those regions. And then wintertime, that's when a lot of things are no longer accessible because a lot of the roads to get to trails are not maintained through winter, so they get covered in snow. Some areas will close. Um, but we do have a really good assortment of, they're called snow parks here in Oregon, where you can, strap on some snowshoes, some cross country skis, and you can, chug out some good sections of trail, maybe along the Pacific Crest, if you want to go up into the mountains. Um, when the weather cooperates, wintertime is a nice time to actually go out to the coast, because you don't have to worry so much about, trails being snowed over. And, during some milder days, wintertime on the coast is especially nice.
We talked earlier about hikes that, are over touristed or, over loved by the outdoors community. And I'm always interested about these trips. And I wonder, is there a super popular hike that actually is worthwhile? For people that maybe don't like the crowds, but they just have to do it. It's just a classic. Is there one in the book that you'd say, yeah, deal with the crowds, give it a go because you're not going to see stuff like this very often in your life?
I think probably my pick for that, I would have two actually. Um, the first would be the Eagle Creek Trail in the Columbia River Gorge. That's it's about a 40-minute drive east of Portland. But there is there's a trail that goes up a fairly deep volcanic slot canyon, where a substantial river comes out of the mountains, and the track of this river just creates these spectacular waterfalls. I believe there's five named waterfalls within the first 6 miles, and it culminates at a waterfall called Tunnel Falls, where if I remember correctly, I think the waterfall is about 160, 170 feet. It falls out of a hanging valley, and the trail to get around this waterfall was blasted out of the rock behind the falls. So, hence its name, Tunnel Falls. And so it gives you a really unique look at a waterfall. You're just skirting the cliffside around this little box canyon, and getting a real close up look at this waterfall. But it's a fantastic hike otherwise, too, because there's just tons of wildflowers, berries throughout the hike. Um, that one is insanely busy on summer weekends, spring and summer weekends. But if you time it right, like going during the week, you can avoid some of those crowds. Um, and then probably the other one that I would recommend is way up in the northeast section of the state in the Wallowa Mountains, there's a really high lake called Ice Lake. That's just it's just a scene out of a kind of an alpine wonderland. Big lake under some really high granite peaks. Um, there's hidden little campsites around the lake shore that make perfect spots to go and set up a tent and spend the night and just stargaze up in this big glacial basin. It's a pretty popular trail, but it's a big climb to get up there. But folks love to do it because it's such a unique and special scene up there.
For listeners who are maybe thinking of, a summer, or maybe not a summer, a spring or an autumn or a summer hiking holiday in Oregon, how would you direct them to explore? Do they come and try and stay in one place for the entire week? Do you think they should consider having multiple bases? And if so, like, what would be the multiple bases if you were to suggest that?
I guess I would suppose it would depend on what kind of hiking they would like to do. If someone is looking at doing some extended backcountry roaming in, some really fantastic scenery, I would probably suggest, um, once again, going up to those Blue and Wallowa Mountains. The little town of Joseph makes a really great place to base, or the nearby Wallowa Lake State Park. And then there's hundreds of miles of trail to go exploring. So you can tailor day trips or multi day trips, whichever you have in mind. Another great location to base out of would be the town of Bend in Central Oregon, which is about a 3 hour drive southeast of Portland. And Bend is kind of Oregon's like outdoor mecca where they have year-round outdoor activity from, rock climbing, mountain biking, hiking, backpacking, paddle sports. They've got lots of winter hiking activities. Um, but Bend is kind of the gateway to Oregon's Central Cascades. And you've got 1,000 miles of hiking trails in all directions. So from Bend, you can plan, day trips to nice lakes where you can take the kids or your dog to getting on a section of the Pacific Crest Trail and going out for several days. And then, once you're done, you come back in and you can enjoy a nice Airbnb or, good food, good beer, and just have a great time.
Is camping a popular way to explore the state? If so, are there any tips you have around, getting camping reservations, or, just having a good time while camping?
Oh, absolutely. There's, good developed campgrounds all over Oregon in all the major locations that I've already mentioned. A lot of these are on national forest lands, and the um, the best way to do it is to go about making a reservation. Most of the camping reservations on national forest land are made through a website called recreation.gov, and you can just log in. You can search for the area where you'd like to go camp and see about making a reservation through the calendar system. It does require a little bit of due diligence because campsites fill up fast, and so you kind of have to know in advance where you want to go and exactly when you want to do it. And then you're at the mercy of whatever weather gets dished out to you when your time comes to go on your trip. There are a number of other opportunities where you can camp in places that are a little bit less developed, that don't require reservations. These are often more remote areas where, you'll have a little bit more seclusion and fewer crowds. And some of these are indicated in my book where folks can go and base themselves and not have to struggle with a busy reservation system, but you kind of in some cases you just kind of have to roll with whatever you can find out there.
And what's it like for overnight backpacking routes? You mentioned the PCT, but are there lots of good weekend or, 4 to 6 day backpacking routes in Oregon as well?
Absolutely, there are. I'm actually in the process of wrapping up my Oregon backpacking book, which will be coming out right on the heels of this classics book. And in that book, I've outlined 70 different backpacking trips throughout Oregon that range from, you know, an easy 1 mile in and out all the way up to the 750-mile Oregon Desert Trail. Within those, bounds, there are more than enough opportunities to get out and enjoy Oregon's trails for a few days at a time. A lot of those are, centered around sections of some of our larger trails, like the Pacific Crest Trail or the Oregon Coast Trail. There's a fantastic hike. It's about a 40-mile hike down the Rogue River, um, in the southwest region of the Oregon coast. Um, but there's lots of another, really great one are some great ones are some of the circuits that go around Oregon's big mountains. Like the Timberline Trail is a 40-mile route that circles Mount Hood, which is about an hour and a half east of Portland. That's considered one of Oregon's premier hiking trails. It's uh, it's a really exciting trail to hike because it's got a lot of variety. Um, and then we have another loop trail that goes around Oregon's central mountains called the Three Sisters. That one's a little bit more challenging because you have to have a particular permit to do it. But um, there's plenty of opportunities for multi-day trips just about anywhere in the state if you're willing to carry all the gear and head into the woods to do it.
Coming back to hikes, your book focuses on the 100 classic hikes. And I'm wondering if you can think of maybe an underrated hike, one that more people should do and for whatever reason they don't do, and really shows off the best of Oregon.
Yeah, I can think of a couple actually. One, I think probably the one that I mentioned previously is there's a trail out on that Stevens Mountain in the southeast region of the state. It heads up this huge glacial valley for about 8 miles. And if you hit it at just the right time of year, which is in kind of like the mid-summerish season, the river is flowing. There's wildflowers everywhere. There's waterfalls pouring off of these 1,000-foot cliffs into the canyon. Um, there's bighorn sheep and mountain goats roaming the hillsides. Um, there's lots of birds and butterflies. It's a really fantastic area. It was one of the last areas that I surveyed for this book, and because it takes quite an effort to get out to that region, but it's definitely a place I feel like more people need to go and discover because it's um, it's it's very unique in its own right, unlike any other areas in Oregon, um, and it's worth seeing.
Eli, it's been great to have you on the podcast today, learn all about Oregon. It is, the way you've described it just sounds like this perfect destination for a long weekend escape or a week-long vacation when the flowers are up.
Absolutely. Yeah. Come visit us anytime because we've got plenty of trail for you to come and discover.
And if people want to learn more about you or your book, where can they find everything?
The best place to find information about my books, about hiking Oregon or hiking the Pacific Crest Trail through Oregon, is to visit my website, pctoregon.com, or to follow me on Instagram at pctoregon.
And then book, which I've got right here, comes out November 1st, I believe. So just in time for a Christmas present. If you've got someone in your family that loves hiking, what better way to get them excited than by getting them that book for the holidays? With that, thanks everyone for listening to this episode of the 10 Adventures podcast. We'll be back next week to explore the world and hear about more epic adventures. Bye-bye.
Start planning your own adventure by visiting us at 10adventures.com and listen to other episodes of the 10 Adventures podcast on Amazon Music, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or anywhere else you find your podcasts.